So, geek culture. This is one that was actually suggested to me by one of my moderators, and I thought it was a great thing to touch on because geek culture has evolved a lot over the course of the last few years, probably the last decade or so, as it's gone mainstream. And having grown up in a space where being a geek puts you in a negative light, I was one of the geeks at school. I was picked on a lot. That's kind of how it went. It was the 90s and early aughts. I mean, it's the way it was back then. I'm not saying it's right, and it kind of sucked a lot, but that's the way it was. But if you look around today, you would think that the geeks are like the jocks were 20 years ago. And in a lot of cases, we are. And so I wanted to kind of look at kind of the way the cultural paradigm has shifted some over the course of the last few decades as my son grows into this period where being a geek is not only okay, it's cool. But before I do, I need to get into some of the things that have happened this week. First, good news on the COVID front. It looks like COVID infections are down about 70%, despite only a 12% vaccine rollout. Not entirely sure why that is. My assumption is that in all likelihood, the infection rate was probably higher with the symptomatic rate much lower than anticipated. But I mean, we have the data, but the data aren't going to be really well analyzed probably for another decade. That's a semi-educated guess. I'm not a biologist, I'm not a virologist, but I have been trained in pandemic response. And if I had to, with what information I have, understanding that it's incomplete, that would be the guess I would have to make on that particular piece. So that's good news. That's absolutely good news. In other news, I have to give a huge shout out to this person right here. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, someone who I disagree with on many, many things, did something absolutely awesome. She has raised, in light of the massive storm that covered Texas, cut their power. I mean, you can quibble about why that was, but she raised almost $5 million in less than a week to help Texans out. This is the way. And this actually proves something that I've long stood behind, that voluntarism is better than government programs. Because I know that most, if not all, of that money will go to direct effort, will be directly to Texans who need help. So what I mean by most is it doesn't mean that she's going to keep some in her own pocket. It means that there's logistics to figure out. You got to put fuel in the trucks to move the supplies down to, but all of the money will go toward helping Texans. This is in contrast to a lot of tax programs where there's a huge overarching bureaucracy to run things. So, AOC, huge round of applause. You have my respect for this. You really do. I will fight you all day on policy, but when it comes to this, you nailed it. Thank you. By contrast, then you got this asshole who ran off to Cancun. Ted, you and I have things that we disagree on. You and I have things we agree on, much like the heretofore mentioned AOC. But if you want to lose an election, this is how. And honestly, if you do lose, you deserve it. You don't jump on a plane and run to Cancun in the middle of a statewide crisis. If you want to put your family on the plane, if people want to bitch about that, it's like, look, I have my family to take care of too. I am responsible for them. And I can't work knowing that they are still in danger. So I got them out of danger so I could focus on you. You know what? I think that's legit. That is 100% legit. It's not legit getting on the plane yourself. And this is why people say some of our politicians are out of touch. Because that was probably the most out of touch thing a person could do. And I will criticize them for it, just like I will praise AOC for the good work she did. But we're not here for that. We're here to talk about geek culture. Now, geek culture has become mainstream. We're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. As always, the Julien McBain Show is brought to you by my patrons, without whose support, this would be much more difficult. If you want to become a patron, please go to patreon.com/Julien McBain. We only have the $5 tier thus far. If you join, you get the ebooks and you get access to exclusive episodes of the Julien McBain Show and my Fallout New Vegas epilogue, of which, guys, I will make sure to get another episode posted here pretty quick. Okay. So I grew up in the late 80s, the 90s, and the early aughts. So I was born in the early 80s. I'm old enough to remember some of the 80s. Like, I remember the hair, and I remember the short circuit type cars, because that was kind of pervaded into the early 90s. The boombox on the shoulder, like walking down the streets of my father's neighborhood in Nashua, New Hampshire. There would be people out there with the boombox. You know, they're walking down the road with the boombox on the shoulder going like this. Okay? And in the 90s, when VHS tapes started to give way to things like DVDs. Was that in the 90s or the early aughts? I think that was in the 90s. I wore out tapes watching Star Trek. Like, dead serious, no shame in it, totally did. I'm pretty sure we had the entirety of The Next Generation taped off of, I think it was Channel 4. I think it was ABC. Yeah, I don't remember which network it was. I just know it was Channel 4. It was Channel 22, Cable 4. If you had cable, it was Channel 4. If you were on the open air, which throughout my childhood we had open air too, it was Channel 22. And I watched some of them in black and white because we only had a black and white television for a time. And I was picked on for this. Now, part of it was because, due to my nature, I'm very obsessive. If you haven't been able to figure that out already. I mean, how much do I love Star Trek? I have a uniform in my closet. Okay? Yes, I have a Starfleet uniform in my closet. I'm a member of Starfleet International. It's the International Star Trek Fan Club. These are all, and I'm not ashamed to say that. But it definitely labeled me as a geek. And because I got labeled as a geek, I was in a subculture that was looked down upon by other people. This is very common in the 90s, very common in the early aughts. Geeks were an outcast subculture, largely speaking. And part of it was because a lot of people didn't understand us. We obsessed over stuff. We didn't like sports oftentimes. I didn't get into physical activities, really, until I graduated. Other than PT for ROTC. Of which I actually credit Star Trek for getting me into ROTC because uniforms. So what happened? And I think that's a good question to have. You know, what happened? What caused geek culture to suddenly become this positive phenomenon? And I'm not ripping on geek culture. I'm curious what changed things. And if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably the advent of mainstream video games. See, back when I was a kid, video games were pretty much the realm of the geek, of the nerd. If you were one of the jocks and you had a video game console at home, you kind of hit it. You know? I mean, not after the Genesis came out. And it was definitely a difference. Like, if you were the Nintendo guy, you were the geek. If you were the Genesis guy, you were the jock. That was a really weird juxtaposition. I don't know how that happened, but I noticed the jocks all got Segas and the geeks all got Nintendo. Maybe it's because of the JRPGs that were common on Nintendo but not on Sega. I don't know. If someone knows, leave a comment. I would love to find that out. But as video games started to go mainstream and the PC came around, and along with PC gaming came things like online gaming. I think the one that really became the first mainstream video game where it was okay for everyone to play and it was cool was Goldeneye 007. First person shooter. You had the laptop gun you could throw against a wall and it would shoot any enemies that run by you. You know, that was probably the first mainstream video game. It was for N64. Everyone loved to play it from every demographic ever. Okay? If you put on Goldeneye and you gave a person a controller, everyone from the prettiest the prettiest girl in class who was not known for liking video games, because the stereotypes existed back then, and they weren't altogether false. We've deconstructed a lot in the last 20 years. People don't fit themselves into stereotypes anymore. To the jock, to the geek, to the band member, to the, I don't know, the kid who spends their entire time in the physics lab, okay? If you handed them a controller and it was Goldeneye, they'd all play together all day. And they loved it. And then I think the one that really, that was the start. And then the one that really killed it was Smash Brothers. Super Smash Brothers. Super Smash Brothers came out and suddenly it was cool to play video games. And everyone loved it. And I think it broke down a lot of those barriers. People broke out of their individual subcultures. You didn't have the jock culture and the cheerleader culture and that was the word, that was what I was looking for with that first one, like the cheerleader that everyone has a crush on, and the geek culture and the nerd culture and it broke those things down because you could all get together and have a really good time playing this game, and it was cool because you were all being competitive with each other, and the geeks could compete. Mostly because that's all we do. So, and I know I've been using geek and nerd separately, and I want to kind of break these down because I think this is something that a lot of people don't really get, and I'm using the definitions as I know them as a member of this subculture, of this community. A geek is a person that has a hobby and can talk about that hobby or fandom in obsessive technical detail. Okay? Like, I'm a Star Trek fan. I can look at any ship in Star Trek that is canon, in any fleet, and tell you what class that ship is. Star Trek Online notwithstanding, because you can actually mix and match parts there, so that doesn't count. But if it's a stock ship, like I started playing Star Trek Online again this past week, I'm really enjoying myself. Paramount does a real, obviously all the actors are the ones that were in Star Trek. I think the writers are all the same because I see the attention to detail in the story. When you get out of Starfleet Academy on the Federation track, you get on the shuttle, you look over, and I identified the ship, and I was excited because it's one of my favorites, the Miranda class. You can pick on me later. It's the same one that the Reliant was in Star Trek 2. I'm like, it's a Miranda class. And of course, what happens? The character that I'm with, another cadet, goes, Miranda class. So this is the type of obsessive detail. Like, I can identify a class of ship just by looking at it, at least for Starfleet. Klingons, many of them. Romulans, I can say it's Romulan. I'm working on it. But that's the type of obsessive detail. Like, I can tell you how a warp bubble forms. And we're not just talking the pseudoscience. They took the actual, the pseudoscience of warp bubbles isn't inaccurate, actually. Because the scientist Alcubierre actually postulated the way that would work is you create a wave, which would look like a bubble in real space, and you move space behind the ship. Warp theory, postulated in Star Trek, is a real thing. And all the Trekkies knew how it worked, and we're all like, wait a minute, you mean it actually works like that? Yes, it actually works like that. A nerd, by comparison, see, I'm geeking out. This is what happens when you get a geek talking about his geekdom. There you are. Other things I geek out about are Entropia Universe, and for a long time, Warcraft. Of which I will still geek out over anything Warcraft pre-Legion. Up through Warlords of Draenor. A nerd by comparison is someone who's just overly studious or a bookworm, but also in a highly technical field oftentimes. So a bookworm's a bookworm, they love to read. A nerd would be someone who loves to read books on engineering or books on physics, books on how the engine of a plane operates. At least that's how I'm given to understand it works. And they tend to be more studious. They're the pocket protector wearing. That's the stereotype. It's really dumb, actually, because I was in that group. I never knew anyone who wore a pocket protector. You know who's a nerd? Steve Urkel's a nerd. I'm a geek. There's your comparison. Steve Urkel was my fucking hero when I was a kid. And the two aren't mutually exclusive. They are not mutually exclusive. You can be a geek and a nerd. But it's really interesting because you see the proliferation of geekdom, and all you need to do to see that proliferation is look at a store that carries Funko Pops. Okay? Funko Pop was pretty much formulated, I believe they were actually formulated for geeks. Like, Assassin's Creed, you can get Funko Pops for. You can get Funko... So the F word accidentally there. You can get Funko Pops for... just about anything now. Guess what? I went on their website. There are Funko Pop figurines for The Office. The Office. Which to this day, I have never seen. Even though every time I turn around, back when I was in corporate world, there were people telling me I had to watch it. They were shocked because I worked at a bank and I had never seen The Office. And they're like, but that's like a prerequisite. Like, not my jam. Although, from what I understand, it probably would be my jam. I just never took the time. Maybe that's what I should start watching. But yeah, no, it's become pervasive. People wear their geekdom. They wear pins. They wear patches on their clothing or on their bags, and no one cares anymore. You can buy Assassin's Creed hoodies, and if I were to wear it into Walmart, I'd probably get a bunch of thumbs ups because it's no longer verboten. And this is awesome. See, and the funny thing was, this is something that my NCOIC and ROTC once said. I think it was Sergeant Major, actually. I think it was my Sergeant Major, because he retired halfway through my high school, and then we got a Master Sergeant. But I think it was my Sergeant Major who said, because I don't know if they were ribbing on me or another person in class, but one of the jocks was ribbing on one of the geeks. And he goes, hey, don't be picking on him. He's going to be your boss someday. And come to find out, that's often the case. But that's just it. Like, geekdom pervaded. We just overwhelmed them with being interesting, I guess. I don't know. But it's amazing to watch the cultural shift. Like, when my son was a baby, okay, 13 years ago, I'm holding him on my arm. His head is resting on my hand. I don't even know if you can see this. Okay, no, you can't. Gotta watch his camera angles. I'm holding my son, right, in one arm. And you can't really see my arm, but I'm holding my arm out kind of like this, right? His head's in my hand. His body's the length of the arm. And I'm looking at him, and I'm burning this image into my retinas. Because to this day, when I hold my arm out, I can still see him. And my first thought was, he's going to be a geek. Because his parents are both geeks, or he's likely to be a geek. That doesn't guarantee anything, but he's likely to be a geek. And I hope that his school is not as tough as mine was. In his school, his whole class plays D&D. I need not let my heart be troubled. I thought that was awesome. As soon as I heard that the whole school plays... I mean, he's in a small school. As soon as I heard his whole class plays D&D... my worries were off the table. We won, folks. We won. Took 20 years, but we did it. I still want to know how, though. And I do liken it back to Goldeneye and Smash Brothers. I think that was the turning point. Because it was cool for everyone to play. And it broke down those barriers. And... another thing was, like, it was really weird. When I went to college, I went to flight school, right? So I'm in an engineering college with a flight program. It's called Daniel Webster. They got shut down after ITT Tech bought them up, and then ITT Tech, of course, got sued out of existence, and rightly so, in my opinion. I believe they got sued out of existence. I know they got closed down. But... The pilots were jocks. But I'm a geek. So I'm a geek, I walk onto the flight line with a bunch of jocks, like, and we're talking like a lot of them are honest to God jocks. Like, my roommate was a champion wrestler. We had half a dozen football players. At least 2 of them were quarterbacks. We had people who took state in baseball, and we had people from 14 different countries in a school that only had 1,200 people. And all of them played, and all of the pilots, not all of them, the majority of the pilots played sports of some sort. What did I do? I played video games. Whoops. And so when the computer sciences department had their LAN parties, because we still had LAN parties back then. I know. See all that gray? We still had LAN parties back then. And I walk in, I'm like, hey, can I join you? They're all looking at me like, but you're a flight student. Flight students aren't geeks. I wish I was making that up. Actually, that was very close to exactly what was said. And they're like, you want to join us? I'm like, yeah, I love playing video games. And they're like, but you're a flight student. It's like, yeah. Flight students are all jocks. No. Kind of lost track. Tangents. This is what happens when I go on tangents. But anyway, I think that as things like Smash Brothers moved into GameCube, and then they started developing things like Battlefield for PC and Call of Duty, and of course then it moved into console, and consoles became the thing especially for first-person shooters, aim assist. But I think that's what did it, is that Goldeneye and Smash Brothers broke down the barrier, and then companies realized what they wanted, and they created the they didn't create, but they mainstreamed the first-person shooter genre. Because, I mean, you had really good classic games, like Goldeneye was, I mean, you had Doom, and everyone liked Doom, but it wasn't really a barrier-breaking one because you weren't playing against each other. You know what Doom was? Doom, for my generation, was when you wanted to be edgy and get away with something your parents would disapprove of. That was Doom for my generation. Because we all look back at Doom now and we go, oh, how quaint. But at the time, it was considered socially unacceptable. Like, that was over the top. Now, my son plays Doom Eternal on his PC with way better graphics and way more gore, and I'm like, you're 13, whatever. That's a paradigm shift. That's a major paradigm shift. No. When I was 13, if I had been caught playing Doom, it would have been an ass beating. Because you were still allowed to do that back then. I disagree with it vehemently, but you could do it, and it was done. So where are we going in the future? Well, as computers become more and more a part of our lives, of which let's be facing it, computers have largely become an extension of us. In a lot of ways, we are cyborgs. We are definitely in a cyberpunk future because we're reliant on this to live. Sitting in front of you right now, I have the computer in front of me. Well, technically it's the monitor and keyboard. The computer's down on the floor. And another computer to my right. And I have my phone, which I have set aside because I'm doing this, but is often right in front of me when my whiskey glass isn't. And I think it's because of the digitalization of our world. It was started with video games, but I think what cemented it was the digitalization of our world. If I had to make a guess, that would be it. The more attached to our computers we became, we looked for entertainment on the computer, which mainstreamed video gaming, which created more geeks, which created what we have now. And now you can be a geek and a jock. You always could be a geek and a jock. It was just unlikely because of culture. The culture changed. And I think that's awesome, because the fact that I can geek out now and people think it's normal sure as hell makes me feel better than it did 20 years ago. moving forward. No, I think I really covered it all. The best part about this job, and I use that term very, very loosely. The best part about this job is I'm able to just talk about what I think and how I feel. And the fact that geek culture is such a big part of my life, and it is now going mainstream, means a lot. Especially since at this point in time, we're navigating the cyberpunk dystopia. This is the Julien McBain Show. The Julien McBain Show is a McBain Manor production. I am your host, Julien McBain. My moderators are Kat, Jay Lambertson, and Captain Aubrey. Big shout out to Kat for providing today's topic. And a huge thank you to my patrons, Red Kryptonite, Jay Lambertson, Spectrum 3900, without whose help I could not do this show. If there is a topic you would like to see on the Julien McBain Show, please do not hesitate to leave a comment. I am always looking for new material. And you all have a wonderful day. We are on the road to 13 million subscribers. Hope you're already subscribed.